Hi, this is Richard Rainey with NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune. I'm here with Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana. We're here to discuss the terrible events of the last couple days and the mood here on Capitol Hill and what may possibly come out of all this. First off, we're obviously Representative Steve Scalise is in our thoughts and prayers as we go forward.
And his family.
And his family.
And the other fellow who's still in critical condition, Matt Micah.
Absolutely. So, Senator, I was hoping if you had if there's any updates on Mr. Scalise's condition or how his family is doing or any other information you can provide.
On the one hand, I know what the press knows about the nature of his wound. But going beyond that, as a physician, perhaps I have more insight. I'm not sure where we're standing. This can be picked up. But he was shot in the left hip. Now, if you put your hand on the left hip, they say they hit bone. The bones in your hip have lots of blood vessels in them. They bleed a lot. If you just move your hand over a little bit, you're going to feel a pulse, your blood pressure, your blood vessel pulse. So when they said that they ran out to the field and tried to stop the wound, that suggests that he was actually hitting those blood vessels as well. And then they mentioned internal organs. I'm a gastroenterologist, but you don't have to be a gastroenterologist to know that your colon goes right there. And so from what we're hearing, it hit his bone, hit blood vessels, and then hit internal organs. That would most likely be the colon sitting right here. They operated. My wife's a retired trauma surgeon. She said typically they go in, at first they try and stop the bleeding, and then they come back later. What we know from press reports, they stop the bleeding, he rebled. Doesn't surprise because it's so many blood vessels, so much blood in that bone. And then they had to go back once more. Once that's stable, they'll begin to do the repair. Steve is going to be in this for a while. His wife will be, his children will be. Again, thoughts and prayers to them.
So obviously he's in critical condition. Can you sort of explain to people exactly what critical condition means in the spectrum of seriousness?
Well, it varies. Most likely because he was hit here, his heart, lungs are not affected. So his brain's not affected. Steve's an incredibly kind of strong-willed guy, so they said he had a good attitude. Of course he's got a good attitude. He's Steve Scalise. Going beyond that, though, he's lost a lot of blood. So they've mentioned he's gotten blood transfusions. You would expect that. You'd be concerned about infection. Was there something that seeded bacteria into his bloodstream? So you'd want to watch that, and that could be a threat. So anytime you have a major wound like this, he's going to be in an intensive care unit. Watch carefully. We should know over the next day or so how he does. He won't stay static. He'll hopefully move up, and we pray not move down.
In the aftermath of this happening, I mean, it took us all by surprise, by shock. Everybody who knows Steve Scalise. You have, as the dean of the Louisiana delegation, you've been here the longest, at least in the Senate, and have become prominent in pushing forward pretty public pieces of legislation. I think about the Health Care Act, your revision to and replacement for Obamacare. When you got the news that Mr. Scalise had been shot, and you being now in a prominent position in the Senate, what went through your mind, and how do you sort of do you feel vulnerable, I guess, is a question. Do you, what's
There's a lot in that.
Yes.
First, I'll tell you where I was. It just so happened we have a devotional group of Democrats, Republicans that meet weekly, and it was actually my turn to speak. And so I was speaking about how we can be God's vehicle to express His will to the world. We didn't know the severity of the wounds, and initially we thought that maybe it wasn't that bad. Although it was a terrible act, an assault upon democracy, we did not know how severe it turns out to be. But at the end, I mentioned the liturgy says we are to be instruments of God's peace. And one way that we, as political leaders, can be an instrument of God's peace is just to return civility. Don't use metaphors which suggest violence. Respect that even if you disagree on an issue, you don't have to use, again, a metaphor of violence because there's someone out there who's unbalanced that will hear that. And that's a challenge to us all, whatever your party. And that's how I finished up my devotional. It was only, and believe me, the folks there received it well. As the day progressed and we learned more of the nature of the wound, how serious it was, you become just increasingly sick. I woke up at 3 this morning just thinking about it. Because just before I'd gone to bed is when we finally got the last notice of where the bullet had hit. We just try and put it back together, ratchet it down the rhetoric, ratchet up the understanding we may disagree, but we don't resort to violence, and protect our democracy.
What's the mood on Capitol Hill now in these hours and now days after the event? How are people coping with it? How are your colleagues in the Senate addressing it? Has it affected business?
Two things. First, I think Paul Ryan spoke not just for the House, but for everybody. An attack on one of us is an attack on all. He got a standing ovation from Democrats and Republicans, as he should. And I was not there, not in the House, I'm in the Senate, but I also applaud because I think that's true. Secondly, we have to recognize that when you have an attempted political assassination or political terrorism, the attempt of the terrorist is to not just kill that person, but to disrupt our democratic institutions. And so, if anything, it should strengthen our resolve that we are going to protect our democracy. We are going to make sure that our democratic representative institutions work even better than before, and that's the way you defeat evil. Good must triumph. Evil must be defeated, and this is one way we do it.
Do you see this event triggering maybe a larger discussion, again returning to a similar place where we were, say, after Sandy Hook or after the shooting of Gabrielle Giffords, where there will be discussions again of Second Amendment rights versus gun control? And what are your thoughts on something like that, should it occur?
Well, first, I think there's already a discussion that began. You mentioned Gabby Gifford, a man who was mentally ill, who had a recognized mental illness and had not been treated or treated inadequately. That's one set of circumstances. We don't know the nature of this person. We don't have a mental history background, although he does have some small episodes of violence in the past. I think one bit of soul searching that's already begun is there's some who will just normalize the idea of violence, whether it's a comedian holding up a severed, bloodied head looking like Donald Trump, or a play in which there's an assassination of Caesar played by Donald Trump, or people speaking of blowing up the White House. We need to move away from normalizing the idea that violence is how we disagree. That discussion has begun. Inevitably, there will be a discussion of Second Amendment rights. This man did not have a mental health history. He apparently purchased his weapons legally and was licensed to carry them. So that will be a different discussion than before. But I think the first discussion is, let's move away from metaphors of violence. There's someone unbalanced who will become even more so motivated to violence himself if others normalize its use.
Do you see a need in any way? Obviously, because of Scalise's presence at that baseball game, the Capitol Police were there. If he wasn't there, there's a good chance they wouldn't have been there. People have said there could have been a far worse outcome, as bad as it was. Do you see a need for greater protection, a change in security for members of Congress?
There will be, I'm sure, from henceforth, if there's a public gathering and several members of Congress, senators are there, I suspect there will be police presence. I will say in my town halls, we always have police presence. We've done that since Gabby Gifford. And it is to protect those there. People, American citizens, should not have to fear that when they come to petition, if you will, their elected official or to hear their elected official, that they should be threatened. Even in our Metairie Town Hall, which is pretty rambunctious, the Jefferson Parish police officers, they were, Sheriff's Department, they were fantastic. And they respected people's First Amendment rights, but they made sure that violence was not allowed. And folks could be there and feel physically safe. Just hats off to Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office, but I can go around, whether it is Lafourche Parish or Napoleonville, East Baton Rouge, Lafayette. It's always the case. Breaux Bridge. So hats off to law enforcement. They are standard presence now at all public events that I do.
And just last question. I was wondering if you had plans for the baseball game tonight, if you were going to be there. I know there's going to be a contingent of Scalise supporters in the crowd. Just wondering what your plans might be.
Yes, I'm going to attempt to be there. And I know there's a lot of folks. Steve's a big LSU fan, so I spoke to one folk that they're going to be wearing LSU, kind of something. And people who haven't attended for years are going to attempt to go. And I think it's just to show that solidarity. People have noted the irony. This is the bipartisan event, right? The one where Democrats, Republicans come together to raise money for charity. And this is the one which a political assassin attempted to disrupt. Again, it's an assault just not on those baseball players and on Steve or Matt. It's upon our democratic institutions. We cannot allow evil to succeed.
Thank you, Senator, for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Richard.